Hello, people. Welcome back to the OCM Botcast. I am your host, Chad Marco. Now, obviously, today is October 31st. It is the final day of the month, which means that we are now enjoying Halloween, one of my favorite, really my favorite holiday out of the entire year. What's not to love about it? You got an excuse to dress up like an idiot, lots of junk food, candies, horror movies, scary stories, but also togetherness. I think maybe that's an odd trait to attribute to Halloween, but when I think back to Halloween's as a child, as a teenager growing up, it always meant spending time with my family. I think my first memory of Halloween, I was maybe 4 or 5, and I lived in the projects. And I'll never forget my costume. I had like this cheap Frankenstein, not the doctor, but Frankenstein's monster outfit. And I think my dad had took us trick-or-treating. And that's really my first memory of enjoying a Halloween Halloween as a child. And of course, as the years go by, I guess it just kind of depends on the type of person you are. If you're more active and social, then I guess you'll graduate from trick-or-treating to Halloween parties and whatnot. But that certainly wasn't the case for me. I'm sitting here on Halloween by myself with a bowl full of candy chips, a nice movie lineup, some books, some horror games. I celebrate Halloween in my own way, but it seems like unless you're someone with a very active social life, Halloween eventually becomes a more of a personal thing, or maybe it's just me. But certainly I do. When I think back to Halloween as a kid, it meant spending time with my family, either going out trick-or-treating, buying a bunch of candy, watching horror movies together. So I just have a lot of fond memories of the holiday. And I think that it might sound weird, but it's fun being scared with other people. It's fun. It's fun to drape yourselves in darkness, put on a scary movie, put on some horror movies, and eat some nice, delicious junk food, and just enjoy that dark yet really just fun experience together with other people. So I love Halloween, and of course I love horror movies. I love candy. So it's without a doubt is my favorite holiday now that I think about it. I mean, you look at my gaming channel, most of the games that I play are horror games. So for me, I pretty much celebrate Halloween throughout the whole year, since I'm such a big fan of horror movies and horror games. But definitely I do it as big as I can by myself when Halloween rolls around. And so I just wanted to spend a little time with the gang for this special holiday, this special Halloween holiday. So with this particular podcast, it's not gonna have the usual segments, news, comments, TOD, all that shit. No OC or nothing. It's just gonna be me. Well, I might as well get to the point of what I'm going to. I forgot. I got to actually explain what this episode is about. But for this episode of the podcast, all I'm going to be doing is reading some stories, some scary stories from the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark series. And I'm sure some of you guys might know of this series. It's a collection of scary stories. It's actually a children's book. I remember reading it when I was in elementary school, or maybe middle school, or both. And I'm sure that at least some of you guys know what I'm talking about, because no one could forget that the art that was used in these books to give a visual to the stories, really, the art stands out more. Hold on, let me adjust the mic a little bit. This might be a little uncomfortable. Guard your ears. But honestly, the art stands out more than the stories themselves, if you ask me. And I'll try to show off some of that art as I'm reading the stories, because that's really a big part of it. The art in these books is just fantastic. Very dark. It's got a very. It's like this sloppy, kind of sloppy, dark, black and white, eerie, disturbing sketch style that he used to draw these ghosts and monsters and different settings from these stories. But yeah, I'm just gonna read some stories from these books, and that's pretty much gonna be the whole episode. I would do more, but it's Halloween day, and I don't have a lot of time to do a whole normal type episode, and I still want to do something special for Halloween. So this is what you're going to get, and I hope you guys enjoy it. But before I get into it, just to talk about Halloween a bit more, because I do have a few more Halloween stories that I remember. Like as far as ones that stand out, most of them have been kind of boring, to be honest. Especially during my later years, but not really boring, but just, it's more so just me watching horror movies by myself as opposed to doing anything with other people. But really, some of the most fun Halloweens I had was when I was doing things with other people. And I remember, I'll never forget, like, I think my most memorable Halloween was when I was in, I think I was in 6th grade, and it was Halloween night, and me, my sister, and I think my brother too, we all went out that night, and we were just roaming our part of the city. We didn't go like all over the place, but our particular neighborhood, our particular area, like we were just roaming the whole thing. And the crazy thing about it, bro, was like not everybody, but so many kids from our school was doing the same thing. I don't know what was so special about that night, but for some reason, so many kids were out. And because I guess as far as the kids in particular, because you know how when you ride the bus to school, it's like a collection of kids from like different parts of a small area. It's like different kids from different parts of a small area, and you all take the bus and you go to school together. It's like all the kids from our bus were just out roaming, and of course other kids as well, but in particular it just seemed like everybody that rode my bus, everybody from that little area was just out that night. And not only that, but the neighbors were actually participating, like actively participating in the whole trick or treat. So you could go door to door and get candy. People had let me move the pot filter a little bit. People had candy. People had Halloween themed ornaments out to kind of like the pumpkins and just, ghosts, spider webs out, just to kind of show their participation in the holiday, so kids would know to go there for candy. So you could go door to door to get candy. I mean, it was a real Halloween, bro. That's what I'm saying. You know how in the Halloween movies with Michael Myers, Halloween comes and you see the kids walking around, like all the different kids in costumes and shit. It was like that, except nobody had on costumes, right? It was just a bunch of young black kids walking around, hanging out, going to different houses, collecting candy, and just doing shit, right? And I never forgot that night, because it's like ever since then, bruh, it never happened again. That night was so special because ever since then, I never seen that happen. And I swear, bro, like every Halloween, I go outside at night and I look around like my neighborhood, and it's never anything really going on. And not to say that, because of course it depends on where you are, right? Of course, some neighborhoods are more active when it comes to celebrating holidays than others, right? But in my particular neighborhood, my area, it's like that night was the only one. That was the only night. I swear, I go out every night on Halloween just for a little bit, just to kind of see the vibe and what's going on. I never seen that happen again. I've never seen just kids walking around together, laughing, running, getting into trouble, and so many houses that were participating and handing out candy. I never seen that since. And that's why that's probably my favorite Halloween memory, because it was like a real Halloween. The only thing was we weren't really heavy on the whole costume thing. It was all about just we're a bunch of kids out at night and we're getting candy and we're hanging out with each other. That was the best. That was without a doubt the best Halloween, the most memorable Halloween that I ever had. And I remember I think it was the following year, me and my brother went out just like last time, right? But nobody was out. Like we thought, I never forget to, we thought the same thing would happen and it didn't. It was like, yeah, we thought the exact same thing would happen, but it was like, it was dead. It was like the previous year was a dream. It was like, it was just some sort of anomaly. We went out, it was just dead. And ever since then, it never happened again. But for sure, that's definitely one of my best Halloween memories. And also another one was when I went to my dad's house. Maybe I was in middle school as well, or it was either late elementary or middle school. And it was a very simple Halloween. I don't think we went trick-or-treating or nothing. We just had like horror movies and candy. But that one stands out because I just remember that was the age where I was still legitimately afraid of horror movies. Like it's rare that horror movies really scare me now. Mostly it's only like horror games that can scare me. Movies don't really scare me anymore. But at that time, that was when I was still young and naive enough to be afraid of horror movies. And I remember, I just remember it was late at night at that point when, people were starting to go to bed, but I was still up. I could not sleep when I was a kid, bro. I would always stay up. And I think it was Halloween that was playing or something. And I just remember being up that night scared. And I think my other brother, my half brother, he was there too. And we would sleep on the same this little like blow up mattress. We would sleep on the same one. And he was knocked out, but I was still up and Halloween was on. And that one stands out because that was the age when I was still afraid of stuff like that. And it felt like a real Halloween, right? When you put on the horror movies and you're afraid to go to sleep that night. That's why that one stands out to me. But most Halloweens have just been me kind of doing things by myself, just selecting a couple movies that I'm gonna watch, like horror movies I haven't seen yet. Getting some candy and just chilling out and watching them. And that's okay. But without a doubt, my best Halloweens were when I could, when I had things to do with my friends or my family, cause I'm the kind of guy, I love solitude. I can entertain myself, but I swear, like my favorite Halloweens were always the ones that I shared with other people, and that's why I wanted to just do something simple for the gang, like reading scary stories. So without further ado, here is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Now, of course, I'm not going to read every story. I'm gonna just Like I read all three of the books, and I just picked out some of the stories that I like, some of the ones that stood out to me. And to be quite honest, going back to these books, obviously, as a grown ass man, these scary stories that are targeted towards children aren't very scary, but some of them just are kind of how should I say? Some of them are creepy and have an interesting twist or something like that. And so I think there's still value in it, but man, I'm so beyond like I'm so like weathered and experienced in horror. This stuff can barely get to me, but it's still some cool stuff here. So let me see if they got like some sort of like, hold on, I'm flipping through the book right now. So most of these are just different folklores and stories that were collected by the author Alvin Schwartz, and the drawings are by Stephen Gamble. So Alvin Schwartz is the writer, Stephen Gamble is the artist. So I think there's like a little prologue or something to. All right. So I'm gonna read this before I actually get to the stories. It's like the little setup. Pioneers used to entertain themselves by telling scary stories. At night, they might gather in somebody's cabin or around a fire and see who could scare the others the most. Some girls and boys in my town do the same thing today. They get together at somebody's house and they turn out the lights and eat popcorn and scare one another half to death. Telling scary stories is something people have done for thousands of years. For most of us, like being scared in that way, since there isn't any danger, we think it is fun. And that's very similar to what I described earlier about just spending that time with your friends and family, where you set up these scenarios like where you're supposed to be afraid. You turn out the lights, you get some snacks, and you put on something scary. It's this manufactured fear situation, and it's equal parts scary because you're taking the steps to make the environment and the setting scary, but it's also fun because you know that you're not in any real danger until the movie goes off and then you start walking around and it's like, what if he's around the corner, some shit. I remember, oh God, and just a good example of this, I remember I had watched Jeepers Creepers. I think I was at my friend's house and we watched Jeepers Creepers, and I remember when I was walking home from their house, it was nighttime, it was dark, and the whole time I was walking back, I was scared because I was thinking, man, that Jeepers Creepers guy could just swoop down and scoop me up like scoop me up like ice cream, and I'd be going like that. But yeah, there are a great many scary stories to tell. There are ghost stories. There are tales of witches, devils, boogeymen, zombies, and vampires. There are tales of monstrous creatures and of other dangers. There are even stories that make us laugh at all this scariness. Some of these tales are very old and they are told around the world, and most have the same origins. They are based on things that people saw or heard or experienced or thought they did. Many years ago, a young prince became famous for a scary story he started to tell but did not finish. His name was Mamilius, and he probably was 9 or 10 years old. William Shakespeare told about him in The Winter's Tale. It was on a dark winter day that his mother, the queen, asked him for a story. A sad tale's best for winter, he said. I have one of sprites and goblins. Do your best to frighten me with your sprites, she said. You're powerful at it. I shall tell it softly, he said. Yon crickets shall not hear it. And he began. There was a man dwelt by a churchyard, but that was as far as he got. For at that moment the king came in and arrested the queen and took her away, and soon after that Mamilius died. No one knows how he would have finished his story. If you started as he did, what would you tell? Most scary stories are, of course, meant to be told. They are more scary that way. But how you tell them is important. As Mamilius knew, the best way is to speak softly so that your listeners lean forward to catch your words, and to speak slowly so that your voice sounds scary. And the best time to tell these stories is at night, in the dark and the gloom. It is easy for someone listening to imagine all sorts of strange and scary things. That's the opening. So, but before I get into these stories, bro, I gotta tell you one story of my own, just to kind of kick things off, because he kind of got me in the, he got me in the mood now with that last part. But this is a true story. This is a true story. Well, it's true that it was told to me and claimed to be true, but this is a story that my dad told me years ago when I was a kid. So it was me, my sister, my stepsister, and I think my half brother was there too. It was either 3 of us or 4 of us. But my dad, he came in the room and all the lights were out. It was dark. It was dark except the light from the moonlight outside. And he was just telling us like these weird stories from like when he was younger. I know one story he was telling about hanging out in a graveyard with some friends and somebody had an accident and died. But one story I never forgot. He said that one morning, it was early in the morning, and this was when he was staying in a trailer park area. And he said it was early in the morning, and he heard some tapping in the distance, like something tapping against the wall. And so he thought it was his stepdaughter, because at that time he was living with his wife and her daughter, right? And so he thought that it was her playing outside. So he went outside. And he said when he went outside, he saw this girl, this little girl. She had on a big blue dress. She had blonde hair and these huge cowboy boots or some type of like just boots, right? And there was a wire dangling from the trailer that she was standing in front of. And that trailer was like in front of his trailer. And he said that she had the wire in her hand and was tapping it against the side of the trailer. And he said that he called out to her, and when she turned around, she didn't have a face. Well, she didn't, like, it was just a skull. It was just it sounds stupid now that I'm saying it because it was obviously bullshit. But he said it was just a skull. It was no flesh. It was no meat. It was just this blonde haired little girl that had a skull head. And I forgot how the story ended. I forgot exactly how it ended. But it's just that night he did such a good job telling those stories because he set it up so perfectly because he started by telling these stories that could have been true, like the story about the graveyard, and then he led into like some more crazier shit. And so we did not know what to think by the end of it. But I just wanted to share that because that's a memory that always stood out to me. My dad was an asshole and not a good father, but that's one of my fond memories of my dad, my real dad, not Dennis. So let's get into these stories. Let's see. So let's get to the first one that I singled out here. Okay, so this one is called The Thing. Ted and Martin. I already fucked up. Okay, let's start over. Ted Martin and Sam Miller were good friends. They spent a lot of time together. On this particular night, they were sitting on a fence near the post office talking about one thing and another. There was a field of turnips across the road. Suddenly, they saw something crawl out of the field and stand up. It looked like a man, but in the dark, it was hard to tell for sure, and then it was gone. But soon it appeared again. It walked halfway across the road, then it turned around and went back into the field. Then it came out a third time and started towards them. By now, Ted and Sam were scared and they started running, but then they finally stopped. They decided they were being foolish. They weren't sure what had scared them, so they decided to go back and get a better look. Pretty soon they saw it, for it was coming to meet them. It was wearing black pants, a white shirt, and black suspenders. Sam said, "I'm going to try to touch it. Then we'll know if it's real." He walked up to it and peered into his face. It had bright, penetrating eyes sunk deep in his head. It looked like a skeleton. Ted took one look and screamed, and he and Sam ran. But this time the skeleton followed them. When they got to Ted's house, they stood in the doorway and watched it. It stayed out in the road for a while. Then it disappeared. A year later, Ted got sick and died. Toward the end, Sam sat up with him every night. The night Ted died, Sam said he looked just like the skeleton. Dum dum dum. So yeah, all these stories are pretty short. It's not anything long, so it won't take me long to get through these. These are pretty short stories, but I like that one because the idea that he saw this creature, this thing that scared him, that had this otherworldly look and presence, and then his friend dies, and he looks at his friend, and he's like, "Wait a minute, this is the thing that I saw." So let's get to the next one. This one is called Cold as Clay. A farmer had a daughter for whom he cared more than anything on earth. She fell in love with a farmhand named Tim, but the farmer did not think Jim. But the farmer did not think Jim was good enough for his daughter. To keep them apart, he sent her to live with her uncle on the other side of the country. Soon after she left, Jim got sick, and he wasted away and died. Everyone said he died of a broken heart. The farmer felt so guilty about Jim's death, he could not tell his daughter what happened. She continued to think about Jim and the life they might have had together. One night, many weeks later, there was a knock on her uncle's door. When the girl opened the door, Jim was standing there. "Your father asked me to get you," he said. "I came on his best horse." "Is there anything wrong?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. She packed a few things and they left. She rode behind him, clinging to his waist. Soon he complained of a headache. "It aches something terrible," he told her. She put her hand on his forehead. "Why, you are as cold as clay," she said. "I hope you are not ill." And she wrapped her handkerchief around his head. They traveled so swiftly that in a few hours they reached the farm. The girl quickly dismounted and knocked on the door. Her father was startled to see her. "Didn't you send for me?" she asked. "No, I didn't," he said. She turned to Jim, but he was gone, and so was the horse. They went to the stable to look for them. The horse was there. It was covered with sweat and trembling with fear, but there was no sign of Jim. Terrified, her father told her the truth about Jim's death. Then quickly he went to see Jim's parents. They decided to open his grave. The corpse was in his coffin, but around his head they found the girl's handkerchief. So in this story, the broken-hearted Jim dies from being separated from the love of his life. His love for her was so strong that he rose from the grave in order to see her one last time. But him being dead, he was cold as clay. And the girl noticed it, wrapped handkerchief around his head. Once he was satisfied, he returned to the grave. They go check the grave, and the handkerchief is there, proving the fact that her story is true, and he rose from the grave to see her. It's a macabre kind of story because you got this zombie this zombie walking around, but at the same time it's kind of It's kind of sweet too, because it shows the depth of his love for this girl. The fact that he rose from the grave just to see her one more time. So the next one is the haunted house. One time, a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in his settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would get scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house. Went on in, built himself a good fire and lit a lamp. Sat there reading the Bible. Then, just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. Then there was a lot of thrashing around and struggling, and finally, everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. He sat watching the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again and step up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The old preacher waited, and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again, slowly, step, 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 closer and closer, step, step, and it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. Then the knob slowly turned, and the door opened wide. This time the preacher spoke quiet like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took hold of his coat. It was a young woman about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and the flesh was dropping off her face so he could see the bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was a sort of blue light way back in her eye sockets. God damn. And she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then she told him to take the end joint of the little finger from her left hand and to lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said, "If you come back here once more after that, you will hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, and you can give it to the church." The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down toward the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at the bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder and they took him on to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to that house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearth rock. He did, and he found a big sack of money. And where that haunt had held on to his coat, the print of those bony fingers was burned right into the cloth. It never did come out. So that's an interesting story where you have the apparent ghost of a woman who was killed by a man, finding a way to point out the murderer who got away with the crime. Well, pointing. Oh, I did not even. Is that a pun? I did not. That was not on purpose. Point. Wow. Because literally, it was he took the finger and it pointed out who killed her at the church. Okay. But really, the thing about that story, it's not so much the story. I think this story, the artwork that accompanies it, and the description of the girl is one of the most memorable things about this book. That particular picture of this girl, just that stringy, wild, thin hair, and that almost skeleton-like face, but like just enough flesh left to just look horrific, and the eye sockets devoid of eyeballs, and like the one eye socket is much bigger than the other, and then the mouth is wide open, and the gape, the thin neck, just the perfect picture of horror. And the way he described it is just wonderful. So this next story is called The Guest. A young man and his wife were on a trip to visit his mother. Usually they arrived in time for supper, but they had gotten a late start, and now it was getting dark. So they decided to look for a place to stay overnight and go on in the morning. Just off the road, they saw a small house in the woods. Maybe they rent rooms, the wife said. So they stopped to ask. An elderly man and woman came to the door. They didn't rent rooms, they said, but they would be glad to have them stay overnight as their guests. They had plenty of room and they would enjoy the company. The old woman made coffee and brought out some cake, and the four of them talked for a while. Then the young couple were taken to their room. They again explained that they wanted to pay for this, but the old man said he would not accept any money. The young couple got up early the next morning before their host had awakened. On a table near the front door, they left an envelope with some money in it for the room. Then they went on to the next town. They stopped in a restaurant and had breakfast. When they told the owner where they had stayed, he was shocked. "That can't be," he said. "That house burned to the ground, and the man and the woman who lived there died in the fire." The young couple could not believe it. So they went back to the house, only now there was no house. All they found was a burned out shell. They stood staring at the ruins, trying to understand what had happened. Then the woman screamed. In the rubble was a badly burned table, like the one they had seen by the front door. On the table was the envelope they had left that morning. So I'm gonna be honest, I hate stories like this. There was a TV show called what was it? What was it? Fact or Fiction? It was this TV show where they would have these short stories that were kind of supernatural or had events that were extremely unusual or unbelievable, and then at the end they would expose which story was real and what wasn't. And so many of those stories were just like this, where somebody met someone who seemed to be alive and then it turned out they were really dead. And I hate stories like that because it's so many different remixes of that same story, bro. I mean, it's the same one. It's like, oh, I met this person, then I found out they were actually dead. I hate stories like that, but I wanted to read this one because it's the perfect example of that same old story that's been told time and time again in a million different ways. So this is my favorite one. This is my favorite story out of all three books. Might as well get this one out of the way. This is my favorite one. Some boys and girls. Oh wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. The name of this story is called "The Girl Who Stood on a Grave." Some boys and girls were at a party one night. There was a graveyard down the street, and they were talking about how scary it was. Don't ever stand on a grave after dark, one of the boys said. The person inside will grab you. He'll pull you under. That's not true, one of the girls said. It's just a superstition. I'll give you $1 if you stand on a grave, said the boy. A grave doesn't scare me, said the girl. I'll do it right now. The boy handed her his knife. Stick this knife in one of the graves, he said. Then we'll know you were there. The graveyard was filled with shadows and was as quiet as death. There is nothing to be afraid of, the girl told herself, but she was scared anyway. She picked out a grave and stood on it. Then quickly she bent over and plunged the knife into the soil, and she started to leave. But she couldn't get away. Something was holding her back. She tried a second time to leave, but she couldn't move. She was filled with terror. Something has got me, she screamed, and she fell to the ground. When she didn't come back, the others went to look for her. They found her body sprawled across the grave. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her skirt and had pinned it to the ground. It was only the knife that held her. She had died of fright. That's my favorite one. I like this one because it's not as if something supernatural happened. It's not a demon, it's not a ghoul, it's not a ghost. The reasoning of her death was very simple and very much in the realm of reality. She had stuck herself to the ground, and she was so scared because of the dark environment that she was in, the darkness, the quietness, being alone in a graveyard, all these graves and dead bodies lying just beneath the surface. She was terrified even before she reached the grave. She gets there and she plunges the knife into the soil and quickly tried to leave and get it over with, and didn't realize that she had stuck herself in the skirt and that she was only being held by the knife. And I love that story because it's within the realm of reality. I really prefer stories that are in the realm of reality, and that's one of them. It's just like, it wasn't a ghost. It's just it was her own fear and panic that got the best of her. She had killed herself. It wasn't even just the knife. It was the fact that her fear was already at a peak. And then at the slightest discomfort, the slightest moment of okay, something is happening and I don't know what it is, she snapped and the fear overwhelmed her and she died. Just amazing. So this story is called Room for One More. A man named Joseph Blackwell came to Philadelphia on a business trip. He stayed with friends in the big house they owned outside the city. That night, they had a good time visiting, but when Blackwell went to bed, he tossed and turned and couldn't sleep. Sometime during the night, he heard a car turn into the driveway. He went to the window to see who was arriving at such a late hour. In the moonlight, he saw a long black hearse filled with people. The driver of the hearse looked up at him. When Blackwell saw his queer, hideous face, he shuddered. The driver called to him, "There's room for one more." Then he waited for a minute or two, and he drove off. In the morning, Blackwell told his friends what had happened. "You were dreaming," they said. "I must have been," he said, "but it didn't seem like a dream." After breakfast, he went into Philadelphia. He spent the day high above the city in one of the new office buildings there. Late in the afternoon, he was waiting for an elevator to take him back down to the street, but when it arrived, it was very crowded. One of the passengers looked out and called to him. "There is room for one more," he said. It was the driver of the hearse. "No thanks," said Blackwell. "I'll get the next one." The doors closed and the elevator started down. There was shrieking and screaming, then the sound of a crash. The elevator had fallen to the bottom of the shaft. Everyone on board was killed. I like that one because it's a story of premonition. It's a story of seeing. Well, he didn't necessarily see his death before it happened, but he got a warning in the form of that black hearse showing up outside his apartment or the house. And at the time, he didn't know what to think of it. He thought it was a dream. But the next day, as he's just going about his business, he sees that sign yet again. But now it's obviously not a dream. And so he connects what he sees in that elevator to what he saw that night. And he knew it wasn't good. That's why he didn't get on the elevator. It might seem superstitious, but it's that connection is why it worked. If he didn't see that black hearse that night and that same guy telling him there's room for one more, he would have got on the elevator. But somehow he was warned of his forthcoming death and he was able to avoid it. Basically, it's Final Destination. Okay, so. Oh, this is a classic right here. This is a classic. So this one is called The Hook. Donald and Sarah went to the movies. Then they went for a ride in Donald's car. They parked up on a hill at the edge of town. From there, they could see the lights up and down the valley. Donald turned on the radio and found some music, but an announcer broke in with a news bulletin. A murderer had escaped from the state prison. He was armed with a knife and was headed south on foot. His left hand was missing. In his place, he wore a hook. "Let's roll up the windows and lock the doors," said Sarah. "That's a good idea," said Donald. "That prison isn't too far away," said Sarah. "Maybe we really should go home." "But it's only 10 o'clock, said Donald. "I don't care what time it is," she said. "I want to go home." "Look, Sarah," said Donald, "he's not going to climb all the way up here. Why would he do that? Even if he did, all the doors are locked. How could he get in?" "Donald, he could take that hook and break through a window and open the door," she said. "I'm scared. I want to go home." Donald was annoyed. "Girls are always afraid of something," he said. As he started the car, Sarah thought she heard someone or something scratching at her door. "Did you hear that?" she asked as they roared away. "It sounded like somebody was trying to get in." "Oh, sure," said Donald. Soon they got to her house. "Would you like to come in and have some cocoa? Hot chocolate?" she said. "No," he said. "I've got to go home." He went around to the other side of the car to let her out. Hanging on the door handle was a hook. I like this story because it has a similar theme to the previous story where someone is able to narrowly escape death. Obviously, the killer was right there by the car, and just as they were driving off, he was about to try to yank the door open with the hook, but he pulled off, and it must have pulled his hook off as well. So they were that close to death. So here's another like classic one, a classic story that you might have heard. In fact, I've seen this story in a similar version of this story in one of the Urban Legends movies, but I'm sure you guys have probably recognized this. This one is called High Beams. The girl driving the old blue sedan was a senior at the high school. She lived on a farm about 8 miles away and used the car to drive back and forth. She had driven into town that night to see a basketball game. Now she was on her way home. As she pulled away from the school, she noticed a red pickup truck follow her out of the parking lot. A few minutes later, the truck was still behind her. I guess we're going in the same direction, she thought. She began to watch the truck in her mirror. When she changed her speed, the driver of the truck changed his speed. When she passed the car, so did he. Then he turned on his high beams, flooding her car with light. He left them on for almost a minute. He probably wants to pass me, she thought, but she was becoming uneasy. Usually she drove home over a back road. Not too many people went that way, but when she turned onto that road, so did the truck. I've got to get away from him, she thought, and she began to drive faster. Then he turned his high beams on again. After a minute, he turned them off. Then he turned them on again and off again. She drove even faster, but the truck driver stayed right behind her. Then he turned his high beams on again. Once more, her car was ablaze with light. What is he doing, she wondered. What does he want? Then he turned them off again, but a minute later, he had them on again, and he left them on. At last, she pulled into her driveway, and the truck pulled in right behind her. She jumped from the car and ran to the house. Called the police, she screamed at her father. Out in the driveway, she could see the driver of the truck. He had a gun in his hand. When the police arrived, they started to arrest him, but he pointed to the girl's car. You don't want me, he said. You want him. Crouched behind the driver's seat, there was a man with a knife. As the driver of the truck explained it, the man slipped into the girl's car just before she left the school. He saw it happen, but there was no way he could stop it. He thought about getting the police, but he was afraid to leave her, so he followed her car. Each time the man in the back seat reached up to overpower her, the driver of the truck turned on his high beams. Then the man dropped down, afraid that someone might see him. That's a really good story because it really fucks with your expectations. You expect the guy in the truck shining the high beams into her car, chasing her, essentially chasing after her car. You expect him to be the bad guy. You expect him to be the threat. Like, what does he want? What does he want? And it turns out the entire time the threat was already in her car. He was trying to protect her. He was trying to alert her to the danger. Each time the man in the back seat got up, he shined a light into the car to make him go back down, essentially saving her life. So now we're going to transition to the second book, where we have a few more stories that I like. So this story is called Something Was Wrong. One morning, John Sullivan found himself walking along a street downtown. He could not explain what he was doing there or how he got there or where he had been earlier. He didn't even know what time it was. He saw a woman walking toward him and stopped her. I'm afraid I forgot my watch, he said, and smiled. Can you tell me the time? When she saw him, she screamed and ran. Then John Sullivan noticed that other people were afraid of him. When they saw him coming, they flattened themselves against a building or ran across the street to stay out his way. There must be something wrong with me, John Sullivan thought. I better go home. He hailed a taxi, but the driver took one look at him and sped away. John Sullivan did not understand what was going on, and it scared him. Maybe somebody at home can come and get me, he thought. He found a telephone and called his wife, but a voice he did not recognize answered. Is Miss Sullivan there? He asked. No, she is at a funeral, the boy said. Mr. Sullivan was killed yesterday in an accident downtown. Like I told you guys, I hate stories like that, but I wanted to tell that one to illustrate just how many stories are just like that. Oh, the guy you thought was alive was actually dead. The girl that was alive, well, she's dead now, but you thought she was alive. Like, I cannot stand stories like that. But I gotta call them out. And there's more than the ones I point out, by the way, in these books. So this one is called The Wreck. Fred and Jean went to the same high school, but they met for the first time at the Christmas dance. Fred had come by himself, and so had Jean. Soon, Fred decided that Jean was one of the nicest girls he had ever met. They danced together most of the evening. At 11 o'clock, Jean said, I have to leave now. Can you give me a ride? Sure, he said. I've got to go home too. I accidentally drove my car into a tree on my way over here, Jean said. I guess I wasn't paying attention. Fred drove her to the head of Brady Road. It was in a neighborhood he didn't know very well. Why don't you drop me off here, Jean said. The road up ahead is in really bad condition. I can walk from here. Fred stopped the car and held out some tinsel. Have some, he said. I got it at the dance. Thank you, she said. I'll put it in my hair. And she did. Would you like to go out sometime? To a movie or something? Fred asked. That would be fun, Jean said. After Fred drove off, he realized he did not know Jean's last name or her telephone number. I'll go back, he thought. The road can't be that bad. He drove slowly down Brady Road through a thick woods, but there wasn't a sign of Jean. As he came around a curve, he saw the wreckage of a car ahead. It had crashed into a tree and had caught fire. Smoke was still rising from it. As Fred made his way to the car, he could see someone trapped inside. Crushed against the steering column, it was Jean. In her hair was the Christmas tinsel he had given her. So yet again, we have that person that was alive was actually dead. That story is okay the first 3 times you ever hear about it in any form. But after that, it's just like, come on, bro. People need to stop. People need to stop using that as their plot twist. And you know what? Now that I think about it, spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. Isn't that the big twist of The Sixth Sense with Bruce Willis? Like that's the big twist. That he was dead the whole time. He died right in the beginning of the movie when that patient came and shot him, but then you don't realize that he was dead the whole. That's all, and it's crazy because M. Night Shyamalan, he gets so much credit for that. I mean, it was a good movie. It was a good movie, but now that I think about it, that movie had the same twist as a lot of the stories in this book. And I'm sure there are many other stories with that same twist. The person you thought was alive was actually dead. And we give M. Night Shyamalan so much credit for that movie. And it's funny now that I think about it, how common that plot twist actually is. So this story is called Somebody Fell from a Loft. I had signed on as an ordinary seaman on the Falls of Ettrick, a merchant ship bound for England. The first time I saw that ship, I knew her right away. She was the old Gertrude Spurshoe. I had sailed on her for years, before when she was painted brown and gold. Now she was painted black and had a new name. But it was the same ship for sure. We had a pretty good crew that voyage, except for one hard-looking ticket named McLaren. He was a pretty good seaman, but there was something about him that I didn't trust. He was kind of secretive, kept mostly to himself. One day somebody told him that I had worked on the old Gertrude. For some reason, he got all tremble over that. Then I catched him giving me all of these ugly black looks, as if he was itching to knife me in the back. I guessed it had something to do with the Gertrude, but I didn't know that. Well, this one day, we was trying to work our way through a dripping black fog. You scarcely know we had all the lights on, and it was dead calm. There wasn't a breath of fresh air. The ship just lay there, wallowing in troll, a rolling, going nowhere. I was standing my watch around midships, and McLaren was doing his trick at the wheel. The rest of the crew was scattered around one place and another. It was a quiet. It was as quiet as could be. Then, all at once, whack! This thing hits the deck right in front of McLaren. He lets go a screech that turns my blood cold, and he falls down in a faint. The second mate starts yelling that somebody has fallen from a loft. Laying out there just forward of the wheel was someone or something dressed in oilskins with blood oozing out from underneath. The captain ran and fetched a big light from his cabin so we could see who it was. They kind of straightened him out to get a good look at his face. He was a big, ugly looking devil, but nobody knew who he was or what he was doing up there. At least nobody was saying. When McLaren came to from his faint, they tried to get something out of him. All he did was jabber away and keep rolling those big, wild looking eyes of his. Everybody was getting more and more excited. We all wanted to heave the body overboard as quick as we could. There was something weird about it, as if it wasn't real. But the captain wasn't so sure about getting rid of it that way. Could it be a stowaway, he asked. But the ship was so filled with lumber we were carrying, there was no space where a living thing could hide for 3 weeks, which is how long we had been out. Even if it was a stowaway, what was it doing aloft on such a dirty day? There was no reason for anyone to be up there. There was nothing to see. Finally, the captain gave up and told us to heave him overboard. Then nobody would touch him. The mate ordered us to pick him up, but nobody made a move. Then he tried coaxing, but that didn't do any good. Suddenly, that loony McLaren starts yelling, "I handled him once, and I can handle him again." He picks up the body and staggers over to the railing with it. He is just about to throw it overboard when it wraps its two big long arms around him, and over they go together. Then, on the way down, one of them starts laughing in a horrible way. The mates are yelling to launch a boat, but nobody would get into a boat, not on a night like that. We threw a couple of life preservers after them, but everybody knew they wouldn't help. So that was that. Or was it? The first chance I had to go home after that, I went right over to see old Captain Spurshoe, who was captain when the Gertrude was around. "Well," he says, "one trip these two outlandish men shipped aboard the Gertrude. One was McLaren, the other was a really big fella. The big one was always picking on McLaren and thumping him around, and McLaren was always talking about how he would get back at him. Well, this wet, dirty night, the two of them was up there alone, and the big one come flying down. Killed himself deader than a heron. McLaren says the foot rope they were using parted and how he almost fell himself. But everybody who saw that rope knew she didn't give away on her own. She had been cut through with a knife. After that, whenever we came into port, McLaren thought we were going to get the police after him, and he'd get pretty scared. But we couldn't prove anything. So we didn't try. In the end, I guess the big fella took care of things in his own way. If he was a ghost that came back, that's what he was. If there be things like ghosts. So this is a simple tale of revenge by someone who he sounded like an asshole himself. So, but I guess that doesn't justify someone tossing you down to your death. But I like the imagery that the author created with this particular story, though. Like, I can see this guy picking up what seems to be a dead body, but at the same time, it's not quite. There's something off about it. It's like, okay, something ain't right about this. This isn't. But whatever, we'll just toss it over. Of course, he recognized him. He recognized who it was, even in its unusual state. And I can just see him lifting the body walking towards the edge of the ship and getting ready to toss him. And then those arms just wrapping around him real tight and just flinging backwards over the edge of the ship, over the railing into the water. I can see it so vividly, and that's what I really like about that story. Is just that particular scene, the way he describes it, and the way I see it in my head. It's just like that's really dope. So this story is called The Bride. The minister's daughter had just gotten married. After the wedding ceremony, there was a great feast with music and dancing and contests and games, even old children's games. When they got to playing hide and seek, the bride decided to hide in her grandfather's trunk up in the attic. They'll never find me here, she thought. As she was climbing into the trunk, the lid came down and cracked her on the head, and she fell unconscious inside. The lid slammed shut and locked. No one would ever know how long she called for help or how hard she struggled to free herself from that tomb. Everyone in the village searched for her, and they looked almost everywhere, but no one thought of looking in the trunk. After a week, her brand new bridegroom and all the others gave her up for lost. Years later, a maid went up into the attic looking for something she needed. Maybe it's in the trunk, she thought. She opened it and screamed. There lay the missing bride in her wedding dress, but by then she was only a skeleton. It was a spooky skeleton. This story kind of reminds me of The Girl Who Stood on the Grave. That kind of horror where it's not necessarily something supernatural, but it's still something that's extremely frightening. For The Girl Who Stood on the Grave, it was just, she was overwhelmed by fear, and that fear was created by the dark environment she was in, the imaginings of her mind, the things that she was thinking and fantasizing about, not necessarily reality. She scared herself to death, literally. And again, her death was her fault. And this story kind of reminds me of that, in that it's not something supernatural that kills her. She ends up killing herself by accident. And not only, of course, that's bad, but also the way she died. She got trapped in this box, pretty much. Just got trapped in a box and was in there for who knows how long, just running out of oxygen, screaming, yelling, starving, dehydrated, and just slowly died. You know, she either starved to death, died from dehydration, or lack of oxygen, but just, it's a horrible way to die. And again, it's not something supernatural. It's something within the realm of possibility, you know, unlikely, but definitely possible. So this story is called The Man in the Middle. It was almost midnight. Sally Truitt had just gotten on the subway train at 50th Street after visiting her mother. Don't worry, Sally had told her. The subway is safe. There's always a policeman on duty. But that night, she didn't see one. Except for her, the subway car was empty. At 42nd Street, three tough-looking men got on. Two of them were holding up the third, who looked drunk. His head rolled from side to side, and his legs refused to work. When they got him seated between them, his head came to rest on one of his shoulders. Sally thought he was staring at her. She buried her head in a book and tried not to notice. At 28th Street, one of the men stood up. "Take it easy, Jim," he said to the man in the middle, and he got off. At 23rd Street, Jim's other friend stood up. "You'll be fine," he said, and he got off. Now, the only ones left in the car were Jim and Sally. Just then, the train went around a sharp curve, and Jim pitched onto the floor at Sally's feet. When she looked down at him, she saw a trickle of blood on the side of his head, and just above it, a bullet hole. So, I'm not really sure, but it's implied that the guys who were propping his body up were the ones that killed him. I'm pretty sure they knew he had a bullet hole in his head. It seems like they might have even wiped him off because there was only a trickle of blood left. They might have wiped them off and then said, okay, we gotta. But then why would they? It's kind of a stupid story because like if they killed him, why would they take him on a subway car and leave him there, but then stay there with him like for different stops? Like I don't get it. I don't understand that. That part is just kind of. But it is a supernatural book, but that's just dumb. I never even thought about that till now. So this one is called The Bed by the Window. The three old men shared a room at the nursing home. Their room had only one window, but for them, it was the only link to the real world. Ted Conklin, who had been there the longest, had the bed next to the window. When Ted died, the man in the next bed, George Best, took his place, and the third man, Richard Green, took George's bed. Despite his illness, George was a cheerful man who spent his days describing the sights he could see from his bed. Pretty girls, a policeman on horseback, a traffic jam, a pizza parlor, a fire station, and other scenes of life outside. Richard loved to listen to George, but the more George talked about life outside, the more Richard wanted to see it for himself. Yet, he knew that only when George died would he have his chance. He wanted to look out that window so badly that one day he decided to kill George. He is going to die soon anyway, he told himself. What difference would it make? George had a bad heart. If he had a heart attack during the night and a nurse could not get him right away, he had pills he could take. He kept them in a bottle on top of the cabinet between his bed and Richard's. All Richard had to do was knock the bottle to the floor where George could not reach it. A few nights later, George died just as Richard had planned he would, and the next morning, Richard was moved to the bed by the window. Now he would see for himself all the things outside that George had described. After the nurses had left, Richard turned to the window and looked out, but all he could see was a blank brick wall. Just imagine how he felt. Just imagine how this dude felt. You basically killed a man so you could look through a window and see outside. And then the man dies, you get his spot, you get his bed, and you look and you see a brick fucking wall. That's why I like that story, because you can just feel what he felt in that moment to some degree. Like just what he had to feel when he looked and saw that brick wall and he thought, I killed that man for no damn reason. I killed a man for this. But perhaps the guy who was describing outside, he was probably crazy, probably had Alzheimer's or something and was just talking out of his head. And then the other guy took it for fact, and then it just the jealousy of it all just took over him and he killed the man. So this story is kind of funny. This story is called The Bad News. Leon and Todd loved baseball. When they were young, they had played on the town's baseball team. Leon had been the pitcher and Todd had played second base. Now that they were a lot older, they spent their free time watching baseball games on TV and talking about baseball. Do you think they play baseball in heaven? Leon asked Todd one day. That's a good question, said Todd. The one who gets there first should let the other one know somehow. As it turned out, Todd got to heaven first, and Leon waited patiently to hear from him. One day, Leon found Todd sitting in the living room waiting for him. Leon was very excited to see him. What is it like up there, he asked, and what about baseball? When it comes to baseball, said Todd, I have some good news and I have some bad news. The good news is that we do play baseball in heaven. We have some fine teams. I play second base on my team just like I used to in the old days. That's the good news. What's the bad news? Asked Leon. The bad news, said Todd, is that you're scheduled to pitch tomorrow. Oh, so obviously the man is about to die. I just thought that one was funny. Some of these stories are meant to be funny. So this is a little song. It's not a story. It's like a poem song. And I'm going to say it the best way I know how. It's called Baroom. O'Leary is dead and O'Reilly don't know it. O'Reilly is dead and O'Leary don't know it. They both are dead in the very same bed and neither one knows it. The other one's dead. Baroom, 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 baroom. O'Leary is dead and O'Reilly don't know it. O'Reilly is dead and O'Leary don't know it. They both are dead in the very same bed and neither one knows it. The other one's dead. Baroom, 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 baroom. It's some dumb stuff in these books. I swear. So I got about one or two more I want to do. This one comes from the third book. Oh, I like this one. This one's nice. So this one is called Bess. John Nicholas raised horses. He had many horses of all kinds, but his favorite was Bess, a gentle old mare he had grown up with. He no longer rode her, for all she could do now was just amble along. Bess spent her days grazing peacefully in the meadow. That summer, for the fun of it, John Nicholas went into a fortune teller's booth. The fortune teller studied her cards. I see danger ahead for you, she said. Your favorite horse will cause you to die. I don't know when, but it will happen. It is in the cards. John Nicholas laughed. The idea that Bess would cause his death was nonsense. She was as dangerous as a bowl of soup, yet from then on, whenever he saw her, he remembered the fortune teller's warning. That fall, a farmer from the other end of the county asked if he could have Bess. He had been thinking that the old horse would be perfect for his children to ride. That's a good idea, John said. It would be fun for them and it would give Bess something to do. Later, John told his wife about it. Now Bess won't kill me, he said, and they both laughed. A few months later, he saw the farmer who had taken her. How's my Bess? He asked. Oh, she was fine for a while, the farmer said. The children loved her. Then she got sick. I had to shoot her to put her out of her misery. It was a shame. Despite himself, John breathed a sigh of relief. He had often wondered if in some crazy way, through some strange accident, Bess would kill him. Now, of course, she could not. I like to see her, said John, just to say goodbye. She was my favorite. The bones of the dead horse were in a far corner of the man's farm. John kneeled down and patted Bess's sun-bleached skull. Just then, a rattlesnake, which had made its home inside the skull, sank its fangs into John Nicholas's arm and killed him. I like that story because the way it was set up, with the fortune teller telling him that somehow your old sickly horse is going to be the cause of your death. Right from there, as the reader, you're curious. Now you're like, okay, well, how is that possible? How is this old horse going to be the cause of this man's death? And then halfway through the story, he sells the horse. So it's like, as the story goes on, it seems less and less likely for this horse to be able to do any sort of harm to him, let alone kill him. He sells the horse dies, so how can this horse be the cause of your death? He goes to visit the bones of the horse. He touches the skull and a rattlesnake pops out and bites him. So what makes it so good, though, I think that it gives the reader a sense of anticipation and curiosity. Like, how is he possibly going to die at the hooves? The horses have hooves. At the hooves of a sickly old horse, a horse that's sold and now a horse that's dead. And then, death finds a way. So this is the last one I'm going to read. And it's a short poem. And it's called You May Be the Next. Did you ever think as the hearse goes by that you may be the next to die? They wrap you up in a big white sheet from your head down to your feet. And the worms crawl in and the worms crawl out, and your stomach and out your snout, and your eyes fall out and your teeth decay. And that is the end of a perfect day. So that were just a few stories from the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark trilogy. There are quite a bit more, but I feel like those are the best ones. So let me get a sip of water. So now that I've had the time to go back to these books, I gotta be honest, most of these stories are not very good. I think that the appeal of these books for me is more nostalgia than anything else, because I can vividly remember being a child in elementary school and having one or two of these books, reading the stories, and being a child. Because and I guess it's part of it is the fact that these are children's books. They are books marketed towards children, and most of the stories aren't really that explicit or dark. There are a few, like The Sausage, which is about a man killing people and putting their meat and mixing it with pork and selling it to the people until until he gets caught. Um, but most of the stories aren't really that explicit or anything. So yeah, they're children's stories, so I don't expect to be legitimately scared or not. But I still look for like good writing, a good plot twist, and whatnot. And having gone through all three of the books front to back, um, I gotta say most of the stories really aren't that good. A lot of them kind of have you kind of leave you feeling like, well, okay, I guess I read that. But then you got ones like The Girl Who Stood on the Grave, like stories like that will always stand out to me. I love stories like that. But I think more than anything, what stands out about this particular series is the artwork, which is interesting because really, you think about it, the art is supposed to be the backdrop to the stories. But I think in this case, it's really the art that makes these stories. It's the stories are really a backdrop to the art. I mean, the art is just really that unique and creepy. I saw this guy who left an angry review on Amazon because he got the wrong edition of these books that didn't have the original art. And that just goes to show how vital the art is to the popularity of these books. Because again, when I look back, bro, if not for the art that was in these books, I don't think these books would have the same sort of I don't think they would have the same sort of nostalgia effect on me. More than the story, some of the stories are okay, but more than anything, it's that art that stands out. The visual that they give these stories through the art of that particular artist is really something else. Um, but even with that being said, I think even though it's only a few stories that really stand out that I like, overall, while reading these books, if nothing else, I feel like these stories make you contemplate your mortality. And you could say that about horror movies and horror games and whatnot in general. But really, I will say that other than the art, what these books do that's special is the way it makes you contemplate your mortality. Because most of these stories, what you have is a living person who comes into contact with something supernatural, some sort of creature, a ghost, a ghoul, or some sort of paranormal event that could potentially lead them that much closer to their death. And that's pretty much the theme of all these stories. And I think that poem at the end of the third book perfectly wraps it up because just as it says, you could be next. Like you could be the next one to die. All these characters and all these stories, they're all trying to avoid death. They're all trying to avoid the inevitable. The only difference in our reality and some of the more supernatural stories in these books is that the cause of our death probably isn't going to be some ghoul or goblin or monster or something. It's just going to be any one of the million other ways you can die. But in a sense, we're the same as these characters from these stories. We're all just walking around afraid to die, not wanting to die, avoiding death, wanting to live. And there are all these forces, all these agents of death trying to drag us into the other world. So whether you believe in the supernatural or the paranormal or not, without a doubt, we have that in common with these characters. Just like them, we're all fighting against the inevitable, the great death. It's just that death comes in many forms. And sometimes we create these forms. We create these fictional interpretations of forms of death. A ghost that can kill you, or a zombie, whatever, right? And so I think there is that value in the overall theme of these books. But that's if you're into some dark shit like I am. So that was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I hope you guys enjoyed some of those stories that I narrated for you guys in my deep, sexy, handsome voice. So yeah, that's it. I don't want to hold you guys up for too long. This is just the Botcast Halloween special. Nothing really crazy, no comments, nothing like that. I'm just gonna give you guys some scary stories, and then I'm gonna go enjoy the rest of my Halloween. And I encourage you guys to do the same thing. I might do like a video game stream or something later, but we'll see. We'll see. I'm still playing Amnesia. Could do something else, but expect another episode of the Botcast, a normal episode, a normal 3-4 hour long episode with all the segments. After about maybe a week and a half or 2 weeks, I'll be putting out another episode. So hope you guys enjoyed that. And I'm going to get the hell out of here and go do some scary shit. So, Wait, I said it wrong. Johnny.